Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. In this episode, we'll be exploring a typology of literary representations of disability. That is to say, on the varied ways in which persons with disability are represented in literature and in film. The place of disabled characters in the literary and aesthetic domain is assigned within a structure of relations. Even though generalizations might be possible with respect to representations of people with disability in literature and film, the literary relations through which they are manifested differ from text to text. The point is that the structure of such relations enjoins us to isolate the disabled character for examination only as a preliminary step towards reinserting them into the interrelated thresholds of meanings that are established in their connections and relationships, not just to other characters, but also to images, motifs, social settings, and to broader ethical concepts that are seen within the literary and filmic text. In other words, disability is to be read as a fulcrum or pivot around which various discursive details emerge, gain salience, and ultimately get transformed within the literary aesthetic domain. As can quickly be seen, in literature and in film, physical impairments are often correlated to cognitive and mental conditions, even when the text is focusing on one aspect as a preliminary to bringing into view a second or indeed third dispensation of disability. We see this, for example, in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, where Pauline Breedlove, Piccola's mother, is identified primarily with a bad foot. Her foot was pierced right through with a nail when she was 2 years old. But we're also told that she has an impulse to arrange movable objects into rows and other arrangements. Gradually, we come to realize that not only is she physically impaired, but that she also has a strong case of obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. It is this disorder that ultimately takes her to clean white people's homes as an insurance against boredom. Her own household, which is shown to be decrepit, poor, and utterly dysfunctional, is thus a direct challenge to her impulse toward strict orderliness. Thus, even though her impaired foot is important to how we understand her character, it is her supplementary OCD that is actually most important for understanding how she relates to her family and to other characters in the novel. As we shall see in a later episode, in Samuel Beckett's Molloy, even though the eponymous character describes himself as having a variety of physical impairments, it is the flux of intricate and peculiar cognitive dispositions emerging from the first-person stream of consciousness mode of narration that defines Molloy for us. Furthermore, generic conventions serve to situate the disabled people differently from genre to genre. In comedies, for instance, disability takes on a pantomime character and is meant to generate laughter. Thus, we have the perennially effective potential for comedy inherent in works in which blindness and deafness are used to establish dramatic ironies. A well-known example is to be found in Hergé's children's classic series Tintin, where the scientist Cuthbert's calculus is given to hilarious malapropisms due to his hearing difficulties. And as we shall see in another episode on Beckett's work, the comedic interaction between the disabled characters in Waiting for Godot and Endgame is used to deflect attention from the pain and anguish that are involved in bearing physical impairments in the first place. Attending to the generic conventions out of which the disabled character is created, as well as the precise context of signification within the individual text, then helps us to highlight the nature of the contradictions that surround the representation of disability. It is important to recall from our previous episode that attitudes to persons with disabilities at any historical conjuncture are often multivalent, even in contexts that appear more enlightened and progressive, such as our own contemporary times. It is literature, and more than anything else, that helps capture these multivalent attitudes toward disability. For literature, and indeed film, provide us with the full range of social attitudes as part of a tapestry in which the contrast between singularity and representativeness and their transformation from one to the other is central to the effect of the literary aesthetic domain itself. And so to our preliminary typology. The first and perhaps most obvious literary and filmic representation of disability is that in which the disability acts as some form of ethical background to the actions of other characters, or as a means of testing or enhancing their moral standing. Martha Stoddart Holmes refers to this kind of representation as critical null sets, convenience containers for the essential human emotions required by the non-disabled characters around them. This particular form of disability representation is so ubiquitous as to be almost universal. In medieval literature, for example, the figure of the loathly lady, usually a hunchback with some repulsive facial features, was put in the way of the chivalrous knight on one of his urgent quests. Typically, the loathly lady extracted a promise of marriage in exchange for information with which the knight was to get himself out of a serious life and death conundrum, after which, bound by the code of chivalric honor, he reluctantly fulfilled his promise. As often happened after sharing a bed with the knight, the loathly lady was later transformed into a comely lass, thus signifying both the perceived enigma inherent in the boon of knowledge proffered by the lady and the problematic nature of female sexuality that women represent to men. Indeed, the boon might be read as a metaphor for femininity itself, for the question to which the hapless knight had to find an answer was nothing other than, what do women really want? The answer that was whispered by the loathly lady was sovereignty, something that could be interpreted both contextually in terms of the loathly lady's ability to exercise her choice of marriage partner, and externally as women's essential desire not to be dominated by the patriarchal codes of the male world. It was never self-evident from the many variants of the story which of these two interpretations was correct, so that the difference between the lady's repugnant exterior and the obvious beauty that this exterior concealed came to represent an ethical conundrum as such. Though the Lovely Lady does not make a direct appearance in later Western literature, we find vestiges of the figure in various folk tales, with a good contemporary literary example in the figure of Circe, or Circe in English, in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. We shall designate this set of representations of disability as null set and/or moral test. From the late 15th century through to the 18th and 19th centuries, disability representations were being used to raise a different set of problems, sometimes going well beyond concerns with social hierarchies and relationships to embrace the confluence of imperialism and the production of various others. Thus, in Shakespeare's The Tempest, Caliban, who is depicted at once as a savage, a wild man, and a hunchback, is read by scholars as a figure of moral decadence that could either stand in for the New World, Africa, or even Ireland, according to Paul Brown in his essay, This Thing of Darkness I Acknowledge Mine, The Tempest and the Discourse of Colonialism from 1994. We find further salience for this idea of disability as a stand-in for Ireland in the 19th century depictions of the Irish in British newspapers such as Punch and other London weeklies, in which the stereotypical Irish figure of Paddy was routinely depicted with ape-like features and a stooped back. The intersection of disability, imperialism, and the projection of otherness is also evident in other texts of the period. In Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism from 2000, Gayatri Spivak argues how much the project of soul-making in J.R.R. depends fundamentally on a contrast being established between Jane and Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic at Thornfield Hall. Interestingly, Spivak subsumes Bertha Mason's insanity into her status as a colonial other, but it is evident that focusing on both the colonial and disability aspects of Bertha's identity allows us to see how crucial her madness is within the binary opposition established between her and Jane. Contrastingly, in Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea, which is written as an imagined prequel to Charlotte Bronte's novel, Bertha is called Antoinette and is not mad at all until a series of events, including her sexual betrayal at the hands of her English husband, sends her mad. It is he that renames her Bertha. And yet, Rhys starts her novel with the death of Antoinette's cognitively impaired younger brother in a blazing house fire, thus installing disability as part of the inauguration of the regimes of difference that are illustrated in the novel. In tracking back the source of Bertha's madness to a colonial encounter between her and Rochester in the West Indies in White Sargasso Sea, Jean Rhys provides a corrective to readings that might hastily ignore the progress of Bertha's distemper and subsequent madness, only the latter of which is represented in Charlotte Bronte's novel. As Martha Stoddart Holmes also shows from a discussion of Victorian literature twin sets, one disabled and the other not, these were often used to outline different trajectories of sexuality and its fulfillment or otherwise in marriage. For female disabled characters, this representation was deployed as a means of deflecting acute social anxieties about the disabled person's reproductive capacities, as well as of the exercise of women's sexuality in general. With a few exceptions in the Victorian period, disabled women became the focal point for the playing out of intense social anxieties about disease, sexuality, and disability. In contrast, In a children's novel such as R.L. Stevenson's Treasure Island, also from the Victorian period, Jim Hawkins is drawn into an adventure with seafarers in which nearly every one of the sailors he encounters has a defining impairment. The pirate who comes to stay at the Admiral Benbow at the start of the novel, and whose map is the initial starting point for the treasure quest, has a horrible gash on his right cheek. Pew is a blind man. Black Dog is said to have a talon-like hand missing 2 fingers. And there is finally the stereotypical one-legged and now legendary Long John Silver himself. This masculine adventure narrative, of a piece with ones by J.M. Ballantyre, H. Rider Haggard, and Rudyard Kipling, among others, plays the male protagonist in an extra-metropolitan setting in which the difference he encountered was supposed to trigger a process of self-discovery that ultimately affirmed his superior status. In Stevenson's novel, disability is integrated into geographical otherness as a mark of difference, raising a key distinction between his novel and those of that genre. Jim is cast into an alien world populated by men whose disabilities are markers of a moral deformity. It is for him a rite of passage, a process of self-discovery, not just of strength of character, but also of how much their moral deficit echoes within him. We shall designate this second class of representations of disability as the interface with otherness, race, class, sexuality, and social identity. A certain duality between content and overall narrative form in terms of disability is evident in Babsi Sidhwa's Cracking India. There, the centrality of the disabled child narrator is undermined by the fact that her precociousness is a feature only of the relationship between herself and the reader, but not in the relations between herself and the other characters within the novel. There is thus a contradiction that borders on implausibility, because she behaves like an adult to us, but is an ordinary child within the narrative itself. In the case of Cracking India, the problem seems to be that Lenny, the young girl's name, is being proffered as an analogy for Pakistan, a young and mutilated country emerging from the partition of India that is nonetheless ancient in pedigree. The disability is thus a device of analogy and does not allow for mimetic complexity that inheres in the experiences of people with disabilities themselves. In this respect, the representation of such disabled figures is still distinct from the representation of non-disabled people, who in many demonstrable cases often reflect upon their sexuality, education, emotional predilections, and other aspects of their experience in their relations with others. As can be seen, in these instances, the disability is being used as a means of establishing multiple and often contradictory values. There is often a disjuncture between the content and the narrative form and structure, and the point at which this disjuncture manifests itself is around the disabled character themselves. This contradiction between form and content tied to disability is also to be seen in Kerry Hume's The Bone People, where the mute child Simon and the abuse he suffers at the hands of his foster father Joe become a stand-in for the asymmetrical and violent intergenerational relations, as well as the dysfunctional nature of Maori family dynamics as a product of the incoherence to have come from colonial relations of power in New Zealand. Noting the fact that it is impossible to entirely separate form from content, For explanatory purposes, we shall designate this category of disability as expressive of the disjuncture between form and content. On a continuum with the categories we have seen so far is one in which it is the disability itself that carries the burden of disorder directly. This does not prevent the disabled character from also acting as the means by which to test the other characters with whom he or she interacts. But in this mode of representation, they are taken as metaphorical encapsulations of the moral problematic as such, either in the form of a deficit or indeed of evil. When Macbeth is informed in Act 5, Scene 5 about the death of his wife, his much quoted tomorrow and tomorrow speech contains an unanticipated reference to disability. He says, among other things, that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But why a tale told by an idiot? The point is not so much to suggest that he is faced with a life that resists interpretation, but that life as he sees it is generally deformed and monstrous. It is for that the idiot is referenced. It is at one and the same time a marker of deformity and unintelligibility. But the thing to note is that this reference is made only at the turning point of the action for Macbeth, when he is bereft of all support and has to recognize what paltry resources he has to fall back on. In a way, the choice of metaphor reflects more upon the protagonist himself as a self-fashioned monster than it does on his environment. However, the reference to the idiot is supposed to encapsulate a deep insight about deformity and evil, whether these are taken as intrinsic to Macbeth's character or as reflections of the moral decay he has engendered in the play. As we shall see in an upcoming episode, in Shakespeare, disability also acts as a metaphor to mark anomalous social states, such as those pertaining to half-brothers and bastards, or children born out of wedlock. Indeed, there's a steady pattern in Shakespeare's plays where bastards are considered to be internally deformed and villainous, their bastardy being directly correlated to a presumed moral deficit and to evil. And so we have the elemental and almost homicidal competition between half-brothers, which reappears in the conflict between Robert Falconbridge and his bastard brother Philip in King John, or between Don John and Don Pedro in Much Ado About Nothing, or between Edmund and Edgar in King Lear, and between Richard and Edward in Richard III. Richard III is an exemplary play grounded on the resonance of jealousy and brotherhood, as well as on the Machiavellianism of a protagonist with a visible physical disability. In Richard III, the disability is placed at the foreground of the action from the very beginning and brings together various threads that serve to focalize the question of whether Richard Hunchback is an insignia of his villainy or the primary cause of it. Richard himself interprets his impairment as making him almost elementally different to all others. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Contrastively, in Julius Caesar, Cassius points out that because Julius Caesar is deaf in one ear and suffers from epilepsy, he is not fit to rule. This serves as part of the justification for his assassination. As we noted earlier, in The Tempest, Caliban is the focus for disability as the encounter with the colonial other. Whereas Ariel is a genial and androgynous shapeshifter whose freedom, as promised, is delivered to him at the end of the play, Caliban, on the other hand, is described as a savage and deformed slave. The question remains open whether Caliban is congenitally evil, having been born that way by Sycorax, or that he becomes warped because of his loss of the island and his mistreatment at the hands of Prospero. We shall designate this category of representation as disability as moral deficit or moral conundrum. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.